Hello there, my friends, and welcome back to our series. It is here that we discuss, review, and do synopses on Warhammer books, novels, and all that good stuff. Although, to segue for a second, I wouldn't actually be opposed to covering some non-Warhammer novels here as well. Maybe someday. Today, though, we are covering a Warhammer 40k book, for once. And contrary to what some of you might have expected, it is not the Horus Heresy. It is in fact a novel that's about as random as they come. Namely, The Death of Antagonis by David Annandale. Why this particular book, you may ask? Well, for the most practical of reasons actually, because I have very recently reread this for some of my Patreon work. And I have it fresh in my mind. So I figured, why not talk about it some, right? But before we begin, I would like to take a moment and remind everyone that if you enjoy these reviews and would like to check out a lot more of my content, including former content from my whole YouTube channel and narrations and such, please consider checking out my Patreon page. You can join as a free member and check out all the stories and stuff there. And I assure you there's a lot of it. And then you can decide if you'd like to support me further. You can also check my Rumble channel for the lore videos from the old YouTube channel. All the links are in the video description. Thanks a lot, and now back to our topic. So, The Death of Antagonis. In case you're not familiar with it, this is actually part of quite a rich set of books and novellas and whatnot called Space Marine Battles. And this series, who would have imagined, focuses on Space Marines doing battle. It's actually a set of standalone books and novellas and short stories, where each is usually focused on a particular chapter or group of Space Marines, during an individual campaign or engagement or major event of some kind. It is actually a good series to learn more about the culture and quirks of a variety of Space Marine chapters. And with the added advantage that you don't actually need to read any of the other books in the series to enjoy it. Most, if not all of them, like I said, are standalone. It also features some very popular 40k books, like Hell's Reach. I think most people are familiar with Hell's Reach by this point. But also other great stories like Battle of the Fang, or Legion of the Damned, or Wrath of Iron, which is actually one of my favorites, and one that I actually narrated a very long time ago. My point being, Death of Antagonis comes from a pretty good series of stories and novels. Unfortunately, the Space Marine Battle series actually stopped a number of years ago, as the latest was published in 2017 or 2018, I believe. Is Death of Antagonis now as good or as epic as some of those I mentioned? I would say yes, and a bit of no at the same time. Not because I think it's a bad story, because I did enjoy it, but because it's quite a different one from ones where, the Ultramarines or the Space Wolves or the Imperial Fists come to save the day. Not to spoil too much early on, because we are gonna do a synopsis at the end of the video, but this is a story about how a completely loyal company from a very loyal chapter can actually suffer under some internal division and eventually let chaos seep in and partially even corrupt them. What is Death of Antagonis actually about? This is a story featuring the rather obscure but very memorable Black Dragons chapter of Space Marines. Even though this is not outrightly stated in the book, these fellows are usually agreed upon in canon that they are successors of the Salamanders. So you know from the beginning that these guys are nice as far as Space Marines go. Or at least, they actually give a damn about the people of the Imperium. However, these Black Dragons also have a very significant gimmick, let's call it. In that one of the unique Space Marine organs, the Osmodula it's called, basically ran amok in their genetics. That means they end up looking a bit different from your average Space Marine, with a lot of bone growths in various places, including stuff like scales or horns or even X-Men Wolverine-esque arm blades, with bone claws and that kind of thing. In fact, one of the main characters, named Volos, has bone blades which extend in and out of his hands or arms. So it doesn't get more Wolverine than that. Which I guess is a bit of an extra positive point. If you want to see Wolverine as a space marine, this guy is that. Now, as you might imagine, these sometimes grotesque deformities don't make them very popular in certain circles of the Imperial apparatus. And as misfortune would have it, there is in fact a Puritan Inquisitor featured in the story as well. And he is as bigoted against them as you might imagine a Puritan Inquisitor to be. Now, is he correct in his suspicions? The answer is no. Because one of the main themes in this book, in fact, I'd go as far as saying that this is the theme of the book, namely the subversion of the pure versus the monstrous. The Black Dragons are to some degree monstrous, but the more quote-unquote problematic they are on the surface, the more loyal and brave and wholesome they are on the inside. Meanwhile, there are some Black Dragons who are more or less free of the Bone Grove mutation, and it is they that are actually more susceptible to the insidious corruption of chaos in the story. Of course, all this is not as straightforward as it sounds, and I'm gonna explain that a bit more in the synopsis. But the moral here is obviously don't judge a book by its cover. And even don't judge someone by his appearance, or her appearance. Now, the story begins actually right in the thick of things, on the titulary world of Antagonis, where a mysterious zombie plague has erupted. The Black Dragons are sent to fight there and save a group of civilians, alongside a force of the Imperial Guard. Things don't go as planned, and some bad things happen, which we're gonna detail more in the synopsis. The Black Dragons here are actually just one company, and it is this one company that we're gonna be joining throughout the novel. We don't actually get to meet the rest of the chapter. The Space Marines are also accompanied by an Inquisitor who actually facilitates the corruption of a part of the company by chaos, even though he himself doesn't realize it. The main antagonist, if you will, is an ancient former cardinal of the ecclesiarchy named Nessun, whom is implied to be possessed by some kind of warp entity, although it's not explicitly spelled out. This guy has his own band of Chaos Space Marines called the Swords of Epiphany, and throughout the story they go to multiple places and planets, and the Black Dragons keep following them. And even though the Black Dragons win most engagements, somehow it appears that the Chaos guys are actually winning in the long run. And that's because the more they fight these Swords of Epiphany and their Chaos machinations, the more the Inquisitor messes things up in his attempt to prove that the Black Dragons are in fact tainted, even though, all they do is fight for the Imperium. Eventually the company gets fractured, with the quote-unquote pure members of the company becoming corrupted, even though all the while they and their leader, a guy named Toharan, who is one of the other main characters, actually believed that they were saving the chapter. It all concludes like most space operas worth their salt, with the bad guys trying to unleash some kind of Xenos-tech superweapon against the Imperium. Definitely worth mentioning is also the presence of another of the main characters, a canoness of the Adepta Sororitas named Sefeno, or the Canoness Errant. She, ironically for a member of the Sororitas, is actually one of the more grounded characters of the story. Which is ironic, given that, the Adepta Sororitas are supposed to be the most fiery and fanatical fighters of the ecclesiarchy. She does support the Black Dragons, for the most part, even though she does use them in a pretty disturbing way at some point in the story. Another of the themes of this is that I would call cursed loyalty. The Black Dragons as a whole have always been treated with suspicion by many Imperial factions, especially the Inquisition, as you might imagine. So even though they are loyal and they fight for the Imperium as best as possible, the Imperium itself, or at least some of its organizations, actively try to prove that they are chaos-tainted, so that they can eliminate them, or best case scenario, banish them. But since they cannot do that, because curiously their gene seed tests always come pure and untainted, they still have a discriminatory stance against them. In fact, it is mentioned a couple of times in the book that some other Space Marine chapters outright refuse fighting alongside the Black Dragons because of their deformities. And then the Inquisition has the surprised Pikachu face that so many people and Space Marines do turn to chaos. But it is also here that we see the dichotomy of the Black Dragons and why they are ultimately very praiseworthy. Because despite all the bigotry against them, they are steadfast and keep fighting, not only for the Imperium, but in typical Salamander fashion, they try to help the average citizens as well. Another theme I wanted to mention is, and I think that's relevant in the story, is how self-righteousness and good intention, taken to the extreme, added with a bit of paranoia, can eventually turn brother against brother. In this case, the quote-unquote pure faction ending up turning traitor and fighting the ugly and monstrous but completely loyal members of the company. So all in all, would I recommend Death of Antagonis? And the answer is yes. If only for the fact that it is a bit more unique than other Space Marine stories. The Black Dragons company does fight against the bad guys, like most 40k books. And while there are bad guys in the book, as mentioned before, the Swords of Epiphany, the focus is not actually on them. The real fight is against their own problems, so to speak. Against the suspicion of other factions against them. Against trickery and even against their own bodies, to some degree. Actually, a fourth theme I think it's worth mentioning in this, and in line with chapter lore, is how their actual chaplain, for example, preaches about embracing the curse. In other words, the entire culture of the chapter is based around realizing that they are flawed, but instead of letting that divide them, it is used to spur them to stay loyal and fight the enemy. Embrace the bone blades and other deformities and defend the Imperium with it, and don't let your gene seed issues dictate the future for you. Next, in the last and second part of the video, as we've been doing for about 3 episodes now, I'm gonna do a brief synopsis of the actual narrative in this book. Maybe for those of you who don't have the book or don't have the time to read it, this might be of some use. Or maybe you just wanna know the story without spending, 10+ hours to read it. Our adventure begins on the titular planet of Antagonis, where a zombie plague erupted and the Black Dragons, a regiment of the Imperial Guard, and Inquisitor Werner Lettinger are trying to contain the situation. Worth noting here that while zombie plagues are the domain of Nurgle, as one might expect, this particular plague is a bit different, and not the domain of Nurgle at all. As it will be revealed later by Canoness Sefeno, this is actually called a Plague of Doubtworm. And this is actually very different from your average zombie plague, because this Doubtworm basically feeds upon the cracks in your own disbelief. If you feel that, even a little bit, the Emperor isn't all that he's cracked up to be, boom, you're possessed by chaos. And this Doubtworm is very insidious and mysterious for the first section of the book, because they don't exactly know what it is. The Black Dragons are escorting a group of civilians to safety, only to discover a bit later that these quote-unquote innocent civilians were actually the vectors of the infection, as they were the most corrupted and infected. Eventually, everything turns into a Resident Evil and Kaiju movie, because all these infected begin to physically coalesce into a gigantic monster called the Doubtworm. And the Black Dragons do get to fight it, but eventually they have to retreat. The planet gets exterminatus afterwards. And here's a very tiny pickle that I have with this book. It is titled Death of Antagonis, but the world of Antagonis is only featured in like the first 50 pages, or a relatively small section of the book. And then the story moves elsewhere. Now, maybe the author wanted to express that everything bad started on Antagonis and named it after that, but I don't know, after reading the whole thing, the title is a bit, strange, for lack of a better word. Next, we get introduced to the dual nature and the doubts some of the Space Marines in the company have. As I mentioned earlier, the theme of the pure versus the monstrous is very prominent here, and the Inquisitor actually tries to convince and recruit some of the less tainted Black Dragons into either reshaping the chapter or condemning their more monstrous brothers. The situation is also not helped because these Black Dragons, quite similar to the Death Company of the Blood Angels, if you know what I'm talking about, actually have several of their most monstrous brothers, locked up somewhere. They're too monstrous and too mentally unstable to, work around regular brothers, and the Inquisitor learns about them eventually. The main characters of this struggle, although there are obviously other Space Marines featured, are Toharan, who is one of the pure Black Dragons, and Sergeant Volos, who is one of the more grotesque ones. In fact, Toharan with his faction will end up actually calling themselves the Disciples of Purity towards the end. Throughout the most of the book, the Black Dragons will chase after the Swords of Epiphany, which are a band of Chaos Space Marines serving a former cardinal of the Ecclesiarchy named Nessun. Now, this Nessun doesn't really get any meaningful backstory, but he's supposedly been around for thousands of years doing chaosy things, and he is described as being a bit of a hybrid between his old self and some chaos entity or demon. Either way, he does have a plan to use a weird solar system scale piece of Xenos technology to wreak the usual untold havoc upon the Imperium. Abaddon would certainly approve. And his warband, the Swords of Epiphany, actually call him Father, and they go about doing his will. Another interesting thing here that I think ties into the theme of corrupt pure versus loyal monstrous is that the Swords of Epiphany actually are described as being beautiful and clean, for lack of a better word, as their armor is gold and all bright colors. The adventure then goes to a hive world, where there is a bit of a rebellious movement and a bit of a civil war eventually breaks out, with the Black Dragons having to murder a bunch of civilians in order to get all the other civilians into a frenzy, and get them to attack the actual Chaos Cultists who are also attacking the planet alongside the Swords of Epiphany. The objective of Cardinal Nessun here was to gather a whole bunch of captives in order to sacrifice them later. The Black Dragons, both here and in another planetoid earlier, do manage to beat the Chaos Space Marines, but with each victory and continuation of the hunt, we realize that this is not the actual conflict of the story. The real conflict is within the Black Dragon's company. Definitely worth mentioning is that the evil Cardinal actually uses some kind of insidious warp shenanigans to quote-unquote infect the pure brother Toharan and the Inquisitor. Now this doesn't turn them instantly evil, but it does kinda guide them in the wrong direction, so to speak. And they increase their persecution of the loyal Black Dragons, and they stop using common sense. The situation isn't helped by the fact that the actual captain of the company dies in one of these engagements, and none other than Toharan is chosen to become a temporary captain. And as he is increasingly losing his grip on reality and common sense, Toharan becomes more and more determined to purge his company of what he views is corrupted brothers. Heck, fueled by all the Inquisitor's nonsense, he would have probably even tried to reform the chapter itself later. Fortunately, it doesn't get to that point. Where it does get to, though, is a weird solar system that I mentioned earlier, where there are these huge planetary-scale constructs that the Cardinal gets aligned and wants to use to enact his grand design. But Sergeant Volos, who is really the MVP of this whole book, manages to unite most of the company and fight the elements loyal to Toharan. The Canoness eventually kills the Mad Inquisitor at the end, and Toharan is stopped by Volos. Still, the company at the end of this is pretty much crippled by the loss of like half of its Astartes or more, and the dragons are left, as usual, in a not very fortunate position. Still, the Emperor's monsters were still loyal, while the pure ones had been corrupted by chaos. And Toharan and his disciples of purity were actually so far gone by the end that they literally join the Swords of Epiphany in fighting against the other black dragons. And that, my friends, has been a brief summary of the death of Antagonis. Of course, this is not all the details and the plot twists in the book, as I do want to reserve some stuff for those who actually want to read it. If you enjoyed this, consider leaving a like, share, subscribe, and definitely comment down below. Is this book one that you read before and enjoyed? Did you hate it? Why or why not? Do share your thoughts in the comments, and you can also let me know which books you might want to see here covered next, assuming of course that I've read them. Thanks a lot, and until next time, the Emperor protects.